Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel or channels, depending on where you're viewing this. This is S.C. Coleman, author. In this video we are going to be talking about constitutionality. This is a subject which is actually very rarely talked about, and when it is, you only ever really hear one side of the story. Now, people who know otherwise tend to actually go and read the U.S. Constitution, but that's very rare, and there's a few reasons for that. And I would say the primary one is the fact that most people consider reading to be boring, even though they read memes, which are essentially like the digital age comic strip, or they will read long diatribes or confessions or relative drama stories about who's sleeping with whom on what obnoxious TV show and which movies are the best to see in theaters. Well, not so much nowadays, but maybe which movies are best to stream, and probably read some rather ridiculous articles that essentially are just a bunch of words and don't teach very much important information. However, our most primary document, as far as the United States is concerned, is very little read. And often those who do read it still end up reading commentary about it rather than the document itself. So here in this video, what I'm going to try to do is present the debate that you will never hear. The debate over constitutionality. It, simply speaking, will never happen as long as there is such a tight control over all of our communication methods. Now, the primary thing to look at when we talk about their argument, which is all we ever hear, is that the motive behind it, the motive behind their argument, essentially every argument has a purpose. In every debate you have a purpose to your side, what you want to argue. What they want to argue is why and how the U.S. Constitution enables them and how it doesn't enable us. Essentially, us versus them. The U.S. Constitution, in that context, is simply an obstruction which needs to be explained. And we get it explained to us why what they do is in fact constitutional, and why when we say no, that's not constitutional, and we what we're doing is constitutional, they then proceed to explain to us why what we're doing isn't constitutional. I think we all know who they are. They are the employees at the DMV. They are the front desk clerk at the library. They are the attendant at the local zoo, and they are the tax accountant, attorney, so-called police officer or law enforcement. All of them all represent an institution, a corporation, and a system which seeks to dictate to everyone else why they are the U.S. constitutional authority, and the U.S. constitutional authority listed in that document, we the people, are not. So, this is how their argument goes. The first is found in a amicus brief, meaning friend of, well, it means friend, amicus being friend, a friend brief from an attorney in Rome to the Northern District of California on behalf of the Vatican Bank, or IOR, the Instituto de Opera de Religione, which of course is mistranslated, but in fact is the Institute for the Operation of Religion. And in it, the attorney stated that the Vatican Bank is not a U.S. citizen and therefore not subject to the law of the U.S. Constitution. So that's an example of their viewpoint right off the bat. Essentially, from the horse's mouth, in black and white, they said it, I did not. That sort of thing. It's It's very interesting how upset and uncomfortable people get when you present to them in their face, from the horse's mouth, the evidence, the concrete, in black and white documents. They cannot say, oh, that's just your opinion, or that's just a theory. They usually say conspiracy theory. Because it is, in fact, from their own voice, written down, it is so-called legal evidence, right? Legality, of course, being in reference to writing. The next thing is that the U.S. Constitution does not apply to foreigners. And this is sort of reciprocal in the terms of the argument from the Vatican Bank about the Vatican Bank not being a U.S. citizen, right? So basically they're saying that the only people that the U.S. Constitution applies to are the U.S. citizens, and that the U.S. citizens are subject to it. It is not the U.S. Constitution is by and for the U.S. citizens. No. The U.S. citizens are subject to it, meaning you are forced to go along with the U.S. Constitution as a U.S. citizen, and foreigners are not, because according to them, it does not apply to them. They don't generally have many concrete arguments. However, that's contrary to, or in contrast, I suppose, to specifically the act of immigration, or traveling to the United States, in this context, the U.S. Constitution, and that the U.S. Immigration Acts are authorized by Congress's responsibility to make a uniform rule of naturalization. However, they also construe this to apply to customs, hence the U.S. Customs and Immigration Enforcement, or the USCIS, U.S. Customs and Immigration Service. The next is that U.S. citizens are administered by agencies of the Constitution. Their argument is that the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, or Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, BATF, is an agency of the U.S. Constitution, thus created under the executive order of a president in the past, and therefore they're constitutional. And this is the same argument that spans all the agencies. They all say there are agencies of the U.S. Constitution, or constitutional agencies. The next is that private property is established under protections against search and seizure, which extends to intellectual or intellect, and corporate property, and also extends to fictitious persons. The next argument is that legal licensure is derived from the right to competent counsel, as stipulated in the U.S. Constitution. Trespass is prohibited under private property protections, and the posting of signage is protected under the First Amendment. These are their arguments. The freedom of press applies to licensed journalists derived from journaling, which carry ID badges. We've all seen those press badges. Congress's ability to use the militia components is indicative of the National Guard. I have heard all these arguments, by the way. And when you unequivocally can countermand them, it ends up making no difference, because your voice won't be heard. It gets silenced and shut down by the individuals proliferating these arguments. The next is that treason is protected because only Congress can decide punishment, and it requires two or more witnesses to it requires two or more witnesses to, I suppose, and they would say even probably accuse of treason. So they can get away with treason because of those two essential protections that they're saying were written into the U.S. Constitution to protect treason. It's pretty interesting. The last one is not so much an argument, but rather observations. Emergency services and public service are Trojan horses with which they act under the guise of the U.S. Constitution, but specifically against it, and to engage in treason and occupation and warfare, all under the Trojan horse of emergency services and public service. They also violate the freedom of the press to enforce legal control, which is essentially the attorney license. They declare constitutional rights administration, and to remove children, to adopt control of the children anyway, into the school system. They then force the children to pledge allegiance to a flag. Now, we are going to talk about the side you, at this current state anyway, will never hear. Today we are learning firsthand the reasons behind each section, each original section to the U.S. Constitution, not the ones that were edited or revised in later. Every part of the U.S. Constitution has a practical purpose to it, a reason for why it was concluded, and we are now living through those reasons. Sort of like the end times, but in reference to the U.S. Constitution, it's the U.S. Constitution times. The opposing argument you will never hear. 1. The U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It is said exactly like that. The supreme, as in no others, law of the land. 2. The current Congress is invalid because it is created under foreign election codes, not constitutional process, but foreign election codes, intellectual property declared so of the International Code Council. Now you can go ahead and say, oh, they're not foreign, they're U.S. based. Either way, in the U.S. Constitution, there is a way to elect congressional members, and none of those ways are followed because they instead adhere to the election code. Thus, they are not a constitutional Congress. None of them are, and the U.S. Congress is also not a constitutional Congress. It is not the U.S. Constitution's Congress, it is the election code Congress. There are many other reasons, but that is the primary main one which they, above all else, want to expunge from all modes of communication, all social media, all movies, all TV shows, all newspapers, everything. Next is that it stipulates there shall be no direct, and again, shall be, right? There's no room for debate or argument. There shall be no direct capitation or other direct tax. It says, or other direct tax. And here you get the word capitation, as in capitalist, or capo, or baseball cap, right? All of these words referencing a head or a head count. So no direct capitation, as in head count, or other direct tax, as in property tax or sales tax, besides the one based on the census or the enumerated tax herein, which is the only tax based on the census. So essentially the only tax in the U.S. Constitution, the only one, and it prohibited all others, is based off of the head count. And that's it. And it will be equal for all head count. Post roads are administered by Congress, as are the standards of weights and measures. Currently, the postal roads, of which the postmen, hence the post office, drive on, are not administered by Congress. The next is that the militia, not police, not sheriff, not state highway patrol, not troopers, not flashing my lights and sirens and other nonsense, not people in body armor, not security guards, none of these people, but the militia is required, it is required of the Congress to call forth the militia, or provide for the calling forth of the militia. Not to call forth of the militia, but to provide a calling forth of the militia. The Congress's responsibility is to set up a way to to call out or call up the militia to enforce the laws of the Union. That is law enforcement. Every law enforcement agency with their stupid moronic constitutional sheriffs and all that other garbage are liars. Just like these other arguments, they're all lies. They're all lying, and they're all explaining why they can get away with acting like tyrants and losers, going around kicking down doors and attacking people who won't defend themselves, and meanwhile kowtowing and runaway and hiding and playing their little surveillance games and setting people on any individual and harassing them and playing their little psyop games and trying to drug people, all that stuff, right? All that little cowardly stuff they do, they lie, they have to lie to explain how they are constitutional, but it's in black and white. There is no room for debate. The law enforcement constitutionally is the militia, which is confirmed, or I would say explained, in the Second Amendment, in which it states the requirement, it's something, I'm going to paraphrase here, because I'm probably get this wrong, thinking off the top of my head, but for the purposes of a free and secure and free state, or securing a free state, with and a well-regulated militia, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So therefore, a well-regulated militia consists of the people who can keep and bear arms. Simple as that. Now, the things that uphold this today, and possibly the only institution that is left to us constitutionally, are the oaths of allegiance. They are not oaths of support. They are not promises of if it's comfortable or convenient. And they're not promises of, well, you know, it's just kind of too difficult right now. It is a promise and an oath of allegiance to the U.S. Constitution given by all members of the U.S. Armed Forces. These other little nimwits out there, I always try to promise and support because they really don't like the Constitution. They really are enemies of it. They despise it, and they begrudgingly put up a plaque saying that they swore an oath, or they swear on a Bible when they are administered into office. Now, I didn't swear on a Bible when I joined the U.S. Marine Corps. I just raised my hand and swore an oath of allegiance to the U.S. Constitution, and I always try to uphold that. Now, the next thing is that you are empowered under the U.S. Constitution in times of emergency or war, of which we aren't. The writ of habeas corpus, meaning having body, is suspended. That doesn't mean a letter appealing to someone saying that your body has been taken. That's what they try to say. A writ of habeas corpus, meaning a writing having body. They say that is a mechanism with which you can appeal to being arrested or otherwise put into the lockholds or lock houses, to not paraphrase, but quote the Return of the King, the end of the Return of the King, where they call them lock houses. They say that's what the writ of habeas corpus is. It's not. The writ of habeas corpus is a requirement for the seizure of someone's body. And that you do not need to have a writ of habeas corpus in a time of war or emergency. You simply go and take them. Simple as that. You don't need to get permission. That's the idea. The next thing is that the no soliciting signs are intended to deprive the freedom of press, speech, and assembly, and the same goes for no loitering and trespass. Trespass is and was originally only allowing the suit for damages or recuperation of damages against property. So somebody's cow wanders over onto your farm, breaking the fence, you can sue the other farmer for the cost of that fence. Simple as that. That's what trespassing is, and no more. The next thing is that the use of force, attempted use of force, or threatened use of force against the Constitution or those parts of the Constitution that allow for the militia, for the armed forces, and for all these other things, that any threatened use, attempted use, or use of force constitutes an act of war and treason, which is death. The penalty for that is death. But the way the Constitution is set up, that is enforced by the militia. So in each capacity, it would be up to the militia to determine what they're going to do to the people that are caught for it. And in most cases, I would say death. But I would also say you should do the best you can to exact the most amount of justice possible, depending on each circumstance. Some people warrant a quick death, other people do not. Now, the Ninth Amendment prohibits the use of one constitutional section against another. We see that all the time. We see the invalidation of one section of the Constitution by another section of the Constitution. Very often, those sections of the Constitution were obviously revised in, because I can't imagine the people that set this document up would intentionally put in contradictory clauses and things like that. But because there's contradiction in the Constitution intentionally done so, we have the Ninth Amendment to stand on, saying that you can't simply invalidate one section with another section. Now, the preamble establishes the purpose, and all else is left up to the constitutional states, mind you, not these corporate states that pretend that they are agencies of the Constitution and say just because we're the so-called the state of, that means we can do whatever we want because we're empowered by the Constitution. No, that's not the way it is. Constitutional states are simply the land boundaries of the country and not the corporations. And then, of course, there's the people. Either way, those are the primary arguments, which you'll never hear about it, but in actuality are unequivocally the valid standpoint of the document, with which it will never be allowed to see the light in this current format. And so I think it's important, especially today with all of the constant narrative to the contrary, that somebody should anyway give the, or try to give the other side of the story, the valid part of the debate that you'll never hear, basically, because you only ever hear one side.